Integratron did is it neutralized the dimension of space. Politicized science is presently doing is all the weather data, solar terrestrial data, and all that is being taken away from the public or deliberately distorted so that you can't get that information. So that has caused a lot of problems for me. A lot of what goes on above the Earth has a mirror image beneath the Earth. There's a whole different dimensional coordinate reality inside of the sun. The sun is basically a transformer that's taking the primary ether force, for the lack of a better phrase, and turning it into something which is capable of measurement and perception.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Onnit, ONNIT.com. Onnit is my go-to resource on the planet. It's great because it's something for everyone, for athletes, parents, gamers, first responders, biohackers, students, all walks of life, all humans. Onnit's committed to the highest standards of quality and efficacy in their products. They have independently certified many of their products to be competition safe, and they're actively pursuing as many certifications as possible. No matter your walk of life, the goal is always going to be the same. We want to tune this human instrument through proper nutrition, fitness, and supplementation. Our body is basically a biological machine that requires a specific amount of maintenance as far as detoxification and cleansing. It requires clean energy input through protein, minerals, healthy fats, electrolyte balance, healthy gut bacteria. That in combination with proper movement and activity through physical fitness practices. It's how we were designed to function and feel better and think better, perform better, and execute our goals more efficiently and effectively. And everybody's approach is going to be slightly different depending on their lifestyle and needs. For me personally, as someone who's on my feet all day lifting and constantly pushing my body, creatine is a cyclical staple as a supplement in my diet. It works by aiding in the regeneration of ATP, which is the fuel source for muscle contractions. It's one of the most widely used and studied sports nutritional supplements. It's recognized as safe and effective. And Onnit's creatine is NSF certified. NSF International is an independent and accredited non-governmental organization whose mission is to protect and improve global human health. So yeah, the vast majority of the supplements and nutritional products you'll find at Onnit have health certifications and tons of studies backing them. They really do their homework and provide the best possible stuff. So Onnit.com, enter the code Philosophical Minds at checkout to receive up to 10% off any and all supplements.
The future is a concept. It doesn't exist. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about
and other things.
Okay, so we are on with Eric Dollard, one of the most unique minds on the planet. He's entertaining, he's brilliant, he's an electrical engineer and author. He's quite possibly one of the most knowledgeable human beings on the planet in regards to electrical phenomena. The only person since Tesla to successfully reproduce a magnifying transmitter, which we'll come back to. But to start, you have many fascinating stories with the Navy and Bell Telephone and RCA. Was the RCA station, was that the one you built in the Mojave Desert?
The RCA station was started by Marconi in Bolinas, California in 1913. At that time, it was one of the world's biggest radio frequency power plants.
And was this the one that was destroyed?
Most of the facilities were destroyed internally, and then the buildings allowed to rot. And the place eventually has been taken over by people that are very hostile towards these type of efforts, and have made sure that that can't be done there again. And my auxiliary facility in the same town was destroyed by the demands of those people upon the local government.
Is this the group referred to as the Commonweal? Is that what you?
Yeah, it's Commonweal is basically what you're witnessing today in the what's going on, with the political scene. Commonweal no longer is underground, but now they're making quite a show of themselves.
Okay. And then I know there's also some kind of issues with the U.S. Geological Survey as well. Is that correct?
No, I don't really have any problems with them, kind of because I stay out of their neighborhood for the most part, but other scientists that I am involved with that are the key players in the electrical seismic forecasting world are under constant harassment by these people.
Oh, jeez.
Kind of like the USGS is the earthquake cartel. My problems are mostly with Greenpeace and Commonweal, and then, the overall real estate criminalities that you have to go through when you have property and what have you, and somebody else wants your property or doesn't like what you're doing on it.
I know you spent some time out at what's called the Integratron. I wanted to kind of get you to elaborate on what the Integratron was, like what its function was, and the significance of that area.
Well, the Integratron was and always will be an enigma. The person that initiated the project, George Van Tassel, and his son-in-law, Daniel Boone, allegedly were instructed by extraterrestrials to build this rather bizarre high-voltage apparatus out in a very remote part of the Southern California desert. And the overall claim was that it would rejuvenate people's vitality, basically resetting their lifespan from a fresh start all over again.
Wow.
Van Tassel had died in 1978. I got there in 1984. The place had been overrun by all kinds of nefarious forces, but a person that was a good friend of George Van Tassel had managed to gain custody of the facility and the property, and then he hunted high and low for where would he find an engineer that would know how to continue this project. And then by a number of rather strange coincidental events, he had come across me, and I was at the Richmond shipyard at the time, and things had gotten rather wild there when I had uncovered a plot to sabotage the shipyard, and I had to leave for a while, so he basically grabbed me and took me down to Southern California, in which I began the process of figuring out how to complete what had been known by Van Tassel and his associates to complete the Integratron, and I had figured it out after about a year or so of interviewing, what people were still alive and weeding through all the UFO crackpots and the rest of the stuff. And there seemed to be a voodoo driving the project, that all necessary things would show up. And so I had pretty much assembled the main power supply, so to speak, of the thing, and then Commonweal came and somehow managed to gain custody of the thing and then ripped out everything that we put in, and now it's a New Age self-worship temple.
Wow. Now, I don't know if this is the same project or not, but I was listening to one of your talks online, and you said, what was the Alexanderson system? In one of your talks, you said, properly constructed devices based on Alexanderson's principles. If you have an antenna in San Francisco and one in LA and everything was aligned right, that if you were standing in the one in San Francisco, you would be simultaneously standing under the one in LA as long as the generators are running. Was that the same?
Well, that was how I had kind of viewed what the purpose of the Integratron was. I didn't really... Well, this is a very complicated and involved subject, so it's kind of hard just to summarize things. The rejuvenation end of the Integratron was a derivation of the work by a person named George Lukoski, who had produced a type of of electrical oscillator that he was getting favorable medical results with on various subjects with diseases. And apparently that served as some inspiration for the Integratron, and of course that brought Lakowski's work back into the foreground again, which now, today is readily available through my work and other people's work. But I always saw the thing from the mathematical standpoint as a transporter. And that if you walked in one location, there was a pair of doors that were in quadrature to each other, and that particular quadrant was supposed to effect the rejuvenation process. But to me, I viewed it as if you walked into the input door on one, you would walk into the output door on another planet, or what the Integratron did is it neutralized the dimension of space, and not only the dimension of time. And the Alexanderson antenna has the same kind of propagation constant, you might say. So when the Integratron was taken away from us, I moved up the road onto the property of a deranged World War II vet who shot at everything that moved, but it offered good protection against the other people, and set up my operation there with the materials that I was receiving from RCA, and actually built a working Alexanderson antenna for the purposes of radio telescope for listening inside the Earth. And it exhibited the characteristics of there was no velocity of light type of propagation. Propagation was operating in another dimensional relationship, but the real estate scammers and the commonwealers and the rest of them managed to have that place destroyed, and 30 years of work and millions of dollars of resources all vanished to the wind. And that was pretty much the end of my work.
Yeah, George Van Tassel, he seemed like a pretty interesting guy. I think he was pretty anti-war and stuff. There was something he said in an old interview I was listening to about experiments conducted in Santa Monica. He said the way you talk into a tape recorder and play the interruptions back, the Earth's magnetic field is the same way. You can put interruptions into it and play them back out of it. An associate of ours created a magnetic coupler with this principle coupled into the Earth's magnetic field and played back TV shows and radio stations that aren't even in business anymore. Is this actually something in your experience that's possible?
Yeah, I remember that. I had forgotten that until you brought it up, but I remember that from way back in the mid-'80s that he'd mentioned that. And I can't say anything definite, but either the guy's a liar or he's talking the truth. And I could see, there were incidences of people picking up television broadcasts that hadn't been in existence for quite some time. I know that is a rare but documented phenomenon. I think there's like even some pictures, of a snowy TV image from some place, completely elsewhere in the world in a completely different time. So Van Tassel, had proposed a lot of interesting things, and they're all enigmatic because, he wasn't really an engineer or a mathematician or what have you, and the project basically just became way too much for them and kind of ground to a halt in the mid-'60s, at which point it kind of turned into, a Space Brothers dog and pony show. And that's what I had to overcome, when I had the ability to operate there and try to make it into something, more scientific. So it was a very interesting period in my life.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I know you've spent a lot of time observing the sun activity over the years. Can you tell us about your research and what you've found? Is the sun entering into a dormant period?
Well, it appears that way. We're in the minimum now. It may or may not climb out of it, but I've been studying the solar activity. I started on this project, I think it was in 1978 at Sonoma State University. Then it was Sonoma State College. My test scores were so high, I'm 99th percentile in the United States in natural science, so they just said, whatever you want to do, we'll pay you and give you the space. So RCA provided me with the HF receivers I needed, and I began a 4-year study of that particular solar cycle that peaked around 1980 during a time in which there was a total planetary alignment of all the planets in the solar system, which had a rather pronounced effect on the sun. There was even a book written about it called The Jupiter Effect. But these were all things that I had learned in RCA, that RCA had been using radio astrology all the way back into the 50s, and even though the astronomers, say that all of it's impossible and get quite upset, sometimes even violent, if you mention such a thing, because it's anti-Einstein, RCA was doing it on a daily basis. And I learned this from RCA, when I was an adolescent in high school. So I decided to duplicate all the experiments or observations at a time in which the sun was predicted to go nuts, which it did, and then had studied those cycles ever since until when my Landers facility got destroyed, and now I have no more HF facilities other than what's in my car. So I have a rather complete research facility in my Toyota Corolla, so I can still kind of get an idea what the ionosphere is doing on a daily basis, and whether there's an earthquake that's going to happen in 12 hours or what have you. But what the politicized science is presently doing is all the weather data, solar terrestrial data, and all that is being taken away from the public or deliberately distorted so that you can't get that information. So that has caused a lot of problems for me.
Now, how does radio propagation depend on the sun and the sun activity, and how is that measured?
The way the solar activity is measured is a specific wavelength is chosen, 10.7 centimeters, which I believe is 2,800 megacycles per second. It's microwaves, and there's a place in Canada that every day measures the power level at that frequency. So one solar flux unit is 1 times 10 to the minus 22nd watts per square meter. If I remember right, I use CGS units rather than MKS, so sometimes the centimeters and meters get mixed up, but they would tend to use meter. So right now the solar flux is about 70 as I received the information yesterday. And the highest I've seen it during my study at Sonoma State was 380. So the lowest I've ever seen it is 59. So after that particular solar cycle, I forget the numbers of them now, cycle 22 was the one that I was mostly tuned into. After that passed, it's kind of the sun doesn't really kick up that much anymore, and there's kind of a generalized feeling that it's going into a grand minimum, which, if that's the case, people will be praying for global warming.
Wow. And I believe in your research, you kind of came to the conclusion that the sun is transmitting from primary force to secondary force. Is that correct?
Yeah. I would see the sun as hollow. In fact, in my researches at Sonoma State, I used to get voluminous material from the Space Environmental Services Center that had images and pictures of the sun for every day, and they would send a booklet once a month with all of that in it. And the sunspots are actually holes that you can see inside the sun. So there's a whole different dimensional coordinate reality inside of the sun. The sun is basically a transformer that's taking the primary ether force, for the lack of a better phrase, and turning it into something which is capable of measurement and perception. And then there's another stage of that where the Earth's atmosphere, or orgone envelope, you might want to call it, then turns that into visible light. And it's that envelope that the radio waves propagate through that allows the sun to influence that propagation. So basically, we're living inside a hollow sphere of electricity, which derives its sustenance from the sun. So when the sun does something, that hollow sphere of electricity that surrounds us goes into all kinds of different activities to the point where there's actually illuminations, which are generally called the aurora.
Oh. Now, I know you've spent a lot of time on Tesla, and how does our modern system today differ from Tesla's telluric antenna system? A lot of people think we should implement Tesla's system, but from what I hear you saying, it's nowadays that would be a complete disaster. Why is that?
Well, for one thing, it can't handle the bandwidth gluttony, and that's basically what destroyed Bell Telephone, was the Silicon Valley crowd and their nefarious activities, and then getting everybody all, addicted to this massive bandwidth consumption, which just continues to grow out of control, just like the size of pickup trucks are continuing to grow out of control, even though they don't carry anything. The other thing is, back in the days when the entire electrical load for a household was a 50 candle power lamp, maybe you could get away with transmitting the electrical energy through the earth. But now that we're up to the 10 gigawatt level, that would be disastrous. Would probably trigger a number of earthquakes and destroy the earth. So the only really practical thing with the Tesla telluric thing is for the scientific study, like using it as a radio telescope to listen to inside the earth. That's basically what I'm trying to get going here now, with very little success because there's no interest in it anymore, and I can't run back to the phone company or RCA to get any more materials. The other is a backbone emergency communication system, so that if there ever is a complete nuclear holocaust, there's still a way to keep essential communications going without the associated bandwidth glut, because there won't be people who will have other things to do rather than peck on their devices, like trying to survive in an extremely hostile environment. So that would be a communication system that the military and the disaster control people could, try to keep the situation going. And that has kind of been a theme in like some of these movies, where the aliens take over the world and the only way that humans can communicate is with Morse code. Aliens have wiped out the whole communication system. Well, the Russians or the Chinese could do the same thing. Just 3 well-placed electromagnetic impulse in the United States, and that would pretty much be the end of everything.
And with these telluric currents, this appears to be the Earth's natural reservoir of organic electricity that actually encourages growth in living things as well. Is that true?
Well, that's kind of jumping over a couple of steps. But you might say that the lightning that exists outside the surface of the Earth has a complementary lightning that exists beneath the surface of the Earth, and that is a lot of times what determines where the lightning is going to so-called strike the Earth, even though there might be a radio tower or something that theory would say is a lot more inviting. It will completely go somewhere else and strike some particular rock in a canyon or what have you, because my observations with my radio telescope system, telluric radio telescope system at Landers is a lot of what goes on above the Earth has a mirror image beneath the Earth. Tornadoes are one example of that. A lot of major lightning storms are examples of that. I would get one way, an overground wave and an underground wave, and then I could compare them with the equipment I had. And I saw this complementary relationship between the inside and the outside of the Earth, and the experiments that my lectures and what have you have encouraged other people, ham radio people, to start experimenting, and they're finding this to be true also with their ham radio transmissions. And there are some people now that have transmitted considerable distances entirely through the Earth, vindicating the Tesla concept. and the signals are much clearer, and there's much less attenuation, and they're not disturbed by any kind of ionospheric results of nuclear or the sun or any of that kind of stuff that normally interferes with the ionospheric communications.
Wow. Now, what are some other ways that these telluric currents differ from the non-native electromagnetic frequencies? Is it like something to do with the size or the density of the waveforms?
Well, they're basically longitudinal rather than transverse waves. So they're kind of, I don't know how to say it, but they're where electromagnetic waves tend to spread out, and you have to have kind of like an antenna array or a reflector to keep them concentrated where you want them to go. The earth currents are the other way around. They're kind of contractional, and they pull into themselves, and they kind of operate more as a line. So what Tesla had actually accomplished between two of his transponders was the electricity would go straight from one to the other without being, altered by the spherical nature of the Earth and all of that. That really befuddled a lot of his contemporary engineers. They say the Earth would just soak the whole thing up, but it doesn't. The power goes straight from one, straight to the other. I think I got into that a bit in my last presentation on the Colorado Tesla transformer.
And with this earth current, is this the same that's being used with the multi-wave oscillator? I believe that was the healing device that utilizes the magnetodielectricity.
There are similarities. Not as the multi-wave oscillator is operated as Lakosky was using it, but it's possible by making some adaptations that those particular type of currents are what are flowing in the conductors rather than transverse electromagnetism. And then when you're sitting in between the two so-called antennas, then that is a longitudinal current if the thing is operated properly, but everybody has their own idea, so I can't really say what's going on when people get a hold of these things and what they do with them. And no one's really interested in listening to what I have to say about it because there's too many preconceived notions.
Right. You're often labeled online as Tesla 2.0, but I think you identify more with Oliver Heaviside. Can you tell us a little bit about him and what he was known for?
So my next presentation will involve the mathematical relationships that Oliver Heaviside developed for electricity, which is the foundation of electrical engineering as it exists today. So he was kind of a Prometheus that stole the fire from the gods, and he got the same reward in the end. He was just left destitute, I think was killed by neighbor kids or what have you. He became a hermit after relativity came out. But his presentation of the principles of electromagnetism are so clear and easy to understand, and the so-called Maxwell's equations, he made them so simple and so algebraic. That's the work. I'm basically finishing his work now that that wasn't possible in his time because things just hadn't advanced enough yet. It took Steinmetz and Kennelly and some other people, and then I finalized it long after all those people were dead. And so what I'm producing now, and it's piecemeal appearing on my website, is kind of the final theory of electromagnetism as it was developed by Oliver Heaviside, with numerous references to Heaviside and Steinmetz and all the rest of the people. And no one has ever done anything like this before. I have taken this to a level that no one ever has before me with my own discoveries and mathematical techniques and what have you. I've managed to simplify the process down to something that you could teach a freshman in high school.
Is this the four-quadrant mathematics?
It's where the four-quadrant mathematics comes from.
I wanted to touch on something. It was something along the lines of a magnetometer detecting telluric noise storms indicative of coming earthquakes.
Yeah, that's the work of Tony Fraser Smith. He was the first discoverer of that. He's a radio scientist at Stanford University. Him and Friedman and Floyd are considered the leading experts. They're both from that area. He had determined that the magnetometer method was successful for forecasting earthquakes, and then the USGS they kind of shut him down, and then he became bitter over that and won't talk to anybody about it anymore. That's kind of what happens to all these people. So the last earthquake at Ridgecrest, there are some other people I know there that are kind of more experimenters, and they reviewed all the USGS magnetometer readings over a period of time and found definite correlations between the magnetometer disturbances and the earthquake. I was in my car in Oregon at the time that earthquake happened, and the night before I got the ionospheric noise storm that just about made my AM radio jump out of the car. And that's always indicative of any big earthquake. Is the ionospheric noise storm is very distinctive from those of tornadoes, volcanoes, and hurricanes and other things that make similar kinds of noise storms. The earthquake one is a very white noise type of hiss for the most part. So I got that the night before, and that's usually the way it is. There's about a 12-hour warning. And I've seen this over and over, or heard, I should say, over and over again. So the magnetometer methodology and the ionic noise storm methodology are certainties. But if you ever tried to build anything like that, then the USGS would do everything they could to have it destroyed.
Yeah, I think you were working on a seismic warning system at one point, weren't you?
Well, that's what I had at Landers. It was a workable system, and the so-called authorities were the county said to hell with the USGS. You got something that works, but before they could get connected, and the utility companies that also were to be connected, the place was destroyed.
Back to the Lakowski multi-wave oscillator. Was this similar to the Rife machine, the Royal Raymond Rife?
No, there's no relationship whatsoever. And the thing that people call the Rife machine, there are so many derivations and misinterpretations or whatever that I can rightly say that none of it has anything to do with Rife whatsoever.
No. And did either one of them, they healed pathogens and viruses and eradicated cancer, supposedly, is that?
Well, the Rife system is based on using a kind of like a vacuum tube, a beam tube, where the Lakowski thing is basically using longitudinal capacitor currents. So they're completely unrelated.
Okay.
Other than they kind of came from the same era, the same type of thinking. And Lakowski didn't have as much problems as Rife did because he was not an American, but the Roosevelt administration had established a kind of Nazi force that later became like the American Medical Association and the Food Drug Administrations and all these things. And they literally terrorized all the people that were developing anything that had to do with electrotherapy and destroyed their works and burned their books. The most famous case is that of Wilhelm Reich. Everybody was against him, and they destroyed everything he wrote and everything he built and threw him in jail, and he died. They broke Rife down to the point that he wouldn't have anything to do with any of this stuff anymore. And then there's numerous lesser people that were also consumed by that Nazi juggernaut created by the Roosevelt administration, who was in bed with Joseph Stalin. So that kind of tells you what was going on.
Now, at one point, I believe you were taken in by Philo Farnsworth. Can you tell us about that time and some of the experiences you had and what you learned?
Yeah, that's from the Bolinas days. That was something that kind of changed my life. So no one had known prior to my involvement with Philo Farnsworth III that Philo Farnsworth II had constructed a successful electronic nuclear fusion device that produced 100 kilowatts of electricity and wasn't much bigger than like 1 cubic yard in size. A very peculiar type of vacuum tube that he had developed. And when I first met Philo, after I kind of gained his confidence, he had showed me some of the tubes that had led up to this particular thing, which they called the fuser. And I had a lot of experience in vacuum tubes, and I'd never seen any vacuum tubes like those before. And that was Philo's intent, was to befuddle me and get one over on me. But he failed. I figured out how the tube worked, and then I asked him, you know, I knew something had happened in that tube. And then he finally broke down and told me that, yes, indeed, his father had created a star in an empty vacuum tube, and that star caused the tube to be basically self-sustaining power itself. So his work was shut down by the Atomic Energy Commission and the Security and Exchanges Commission, which descended upon his patent assigner, IT&T, International Telephone and Telegraph, and so IT&T was forced to get rid of Farnsworth, and then he died of bleeding ulcers several years later.
Is that I, not AT&T, but IT&T?
International Telephone and Telegraph, yeah. So they're a big defense contractor, or were back then, and a bit of a competitor to AT&T, but only in terms of equipment, because AT&T had the actual, long lines facilities, where IT&T, they kind of just made equipment. They didn't, have miles and miles of wire.
Yeah. Now I want to talk about church history and what's going on with some of these old Oregon church cathedrals. This is kind of fascinating to me, so I was going to ask you about that.
I do listen to that music on a daily basis. That helps tune my mind up for the mathematics.
And I believe they used to have some kind of events at the Grace Cathedral.
Yeah, they have a 7,200 pipe organ there. And they did an organ concert series for 1 year surrounding the interval in which all the planets lined up, which produced a rather phenomenal concert, because the final performance was on the night that all the planets lined up. And the church basically sounded, like it was going to explode. The power built up to a level that it actually terrified the two organists that were playing the keyboards of the system, and the audience just went nuts. So there was some kind of cosmic alignment that went on, which led me to believe that those things happened in the past, and the people that built the churches and organs had known them, and that was engineered. In fact, I put together a presentation called "The Power of the Ether as Related to Music and Electricity," that kind of got into the ideas surrounding what these people were doing back then and how they thought.
And then there's a specific, if I'm not mistaken, there's a specific place inside the church that you would sit in order to kind of receive the full...
It's the geometric center of all four organs. And it was important to get that spot, because then you'd be at the focal point.
And that's something to do with the waves. They're kind of all coming together in that location?
Yeah, it's kind of like a singularity. It's kind of like the middle of the Farnsworth fuser tube.
I think in one of your previous interviews, you mentioned, I think it was in relation to, I don't know if it was the Bolinas, but you were told by the old timers there were about 5 more places that are energetically similar on the Earth.
Yeah, that's what I learned from the old Marconi guys. Is there were like 5 spots on the planet that Marconi had selected that were kind of like, ley line zones or what have you. And Bolinas is definitely one. There's no doubt about that. That place was really a magic spot for all of this. Even thousands of years earlier, the Indians used to regard it as kind of like a cosmic charging zone, and they would go there and get charged up to the point where they realized if they stayed any longer that something bad would happen, and then they would leave there.
Wow, and this is something to do with like an energetic ley lines kind of crossing?
Yeah, you could virtually see it. The San Andreas Fault goes into the ocean there. The San Gregorio Fault comes out of the ocean nearby, and everything's just lined up, and it goes right square through the center of that Marconi powerhouse. It's really quite a crime to humanity that place got trashed.
I believe I was in Oahu, and there was a Marconi building in
Hawaii?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the station that operated in tandem with Bolinas.
Oh, okay.
And the basic architecture of the building would have been pretty close to the one that was in Bolinas. And the Navy used those facilities, Bolinas and Hawaii, for their submarine communications during World War II. That was the last use of the Alexanderson system, and then they destroyed it when they left.
There was something you said, I think it was in the interview you did with Greg Carlwood. You said you were talking about how you can determine what direction north is by using a stick and shadows. This was really interesting to me. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's real easy. I mean, there's nothing magic about it. When it's noon, providing that you're not using daylight savings time, but if you're using real time and not mutant time at noon, the shadow is the shortest, and it points north. So if you want it a little more exact, you kind of compensate for where you are in your time zone. But normally what I do is I just wait until it's true noon and have a stick in the ground, and then at true noon, the way you can find that is if you take a little rock and you put it at the tip of the shadow of the stick, and every 15 minutes you put a rock at the tip of the shadow, it will draw a hyperbolic curve. And the point of inflection of that curve, where the shadow is the shortest, will be north. To determine also what time true noon is. So here, true noon would be 11:30 rather than 12.
And with magnetic compasses, what is it that...
That does not give you north, that gives you where the north magnetic pole is.
Oh, okay. Is there any type of magnetism at the South Pole?
Yeah, all lines of force have to be closed. And any current that's associated with them and any force that those currents generated all basically work together. So the Earth cannot possibly have a magnetic field unless there's current flow inside the Earth. And if you have current flow and a magnetic field, there are also mechanical forces that are exerted upon the Earth, and this is part of what influences the earthquake. So you cannot separate current, magnetism, nor force, as physicists try to do. It's all one thing. So when an earthquake is getting ready to let loose, a major one, there are enormous magnetic fields and enormous current flows, millions and millions of amperes, which generate very powerful forces which are strong enough then to initiate an earthquake. So trying to pinpoint cause and effect in these things can be very difficult.
Now you have I think it's a Navy Special Forces transceiver that you monitor with in your car. What all does that device tell you?
That tells me what the ionosphere is doing.
What impressive machines currently or historically have you came across in your research that show the most promise in terms of energy output versus input?
Well, you're kind of implying something that's like free energy or produces more out than it does in. Is that what you're asking?
Possibly, if you have encountered anything like that. That's
I encountered that once. There's a widely available video on YouTube that shows us putting measurements on a type of device that theoretically would synthesize energy, and it did appear to be over 100% efficient. But that was an anomaly, and it's very difficult to measure things like that. But I did come up with a mathematical explanation, but I have not been able to find anybody to continue with that work, and presently I do not have facilities to do much of anything other than write my notes, so I'm kind of out of it right now.
Do you recall the name of that video or how people could find that?
Oh, it's one of the what are called the Borderland videos. There's 3 of them. 2 of them deal with Tesla's longitudinal transmission. One is actually, there's 4 videos. So there's one that's actually filmed at the Bolinas site right as it was being destroyed. There's 2 that were made in the Santa Barbara area relating to the Tesla transformer, and then there was one made in the Santa Barbara area where it was kind of a broad demonstrations, and I think in slang it's called the free energy video.
Okay.
But they're very popular. They're poor copies or what have you, but nevertheless, they're widespread. They shouldn't be hard to find.
Okay.
And I recently watched an old interview with a guy named Bruce De Palma about the N machine, and he was describing.
Yeah, I know. He was a denizen of Santa Barbara. I know Bruce De Palma, or knew him.
Oh, okay. He seemed like a pretty cool guy.
Yeah, he was a bit of a charlatan. So
Oh, yeah.
there's nothing really there that demonstrates any type of energy synthesis.
Okay.
It's kind of a typical situation that existed back then. You know, these guys were soaking up a lot of money, and they weren't really producing anything that was feasible. I had my own way of going about it, but anytime I ever got any money, it was always embezzled from me, and everything went to the dump. So I couldn't get too far. But I still have something like that cooking with Aaron that we're working on. That's something that did not go to the dump, that somebody managed to save, that's hidden away in some corner somewhere, where my original ideas on this can possibly be studied. But the problem is, again, there's other things that need to be done, and you got to have the place to put the things and all that, and without any real substantive support, it's not possible for me or anybody to really do any of these things. So I've kind of called it all. It's all a dead horse. This society has no more interest in anything other than pecking on their keyboards and their virtual realities. And the stuff I'm basically writing now, no one's interested in that anymore. I just do it, to keep my own sanity and learn new things all the time. It's kind of exhilarating, to get this highly lucid picture of electromagnetism and just see how everything works so clearly. It makes me feel good.
Right. Well, it's fascinating to me, and I'm trying to hopefully expose some more people to it. Maybe, who knows, you never know, it could make a difference, and hopefully some people, maybe it could help funding different projects.
The situation is, in this social structure we have today, is anything concrete is obsolete. So, there's no more long-distance telephone. There's no more really, ionospheric radio communications or any of this kind of stuff. There's no more electrical engineering. It's all cookbooked off the internet. It's just nobody's interested. Period. This culture, or whatever you want to call it, we have now has made itself evident, with this political fracas that we're going through, and these completely useless people that can't do anything at all, and they're not interested in anything. And, the days of a philanthropist like I had, Josh Reynolds, putting substantial quantities of money into this, no more. It's gone. I've spent, since my Landers facility got bulldozed, I've spent, over 10 years, hoping that my writings and what have you would finally bring in the big lump cash and get a laboratory built, but not going anywhere. And I can't find, the people to run with me on this anymore because they're so consumed by their life strife that they can't even spend 15 or 20 minutes to even stop and talk about anything. So, dead horse farms. It's over. So basically, right now I'm kind of like Pythagoras was in his time, is to get the stuff all quantified and packed away somewhere so that the understanding of electricity is not lost forever to the Einsteiners and the rest of the academia swine.
Yeah, I was going to actually, about Einstein, when I was watching that interview, one of the things that Bruce was describing is how his theory of relativity is flawed. And I think you also mentioned that he used an example of if you move a wire past a magnet versus a magnet past a wire, you should get the same effect, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And then I think you have something with anti-relativity.
Yeah, that was a slang given to my first really full video presentation that I did at the San Francisco Tesla Society, which was immediately suppressed. Just like my original presentation that I did long time ago that Reynolds funded for the U.S. Psychotronics Association has been thoroughly suppressed. But some people connived and they managed to get that video out. I think it's called the History and Theory of Electricity, and its nickname is Explosion at the Shipyard. And that was all about how this, this quantum relativity and all this stuff kind of was like a malignant tumor that grew on the science of electricity and killed it.
Now, with your PRC-47 transceiver, this is essentially you can communicate with anyone on the planet with this for free. Is that correct?
Depending on solar conditions and what have you, but during the day it's nominally 1,000 miles, and at night it's 10,000 miles. So, for example, in the evening when I'm living in my car, most of the international shortwave stations are all gone now, thanks to digital. But there's still a few floating around there, and there's one station I listen to out of Greece every night that plays all music, and they play some of the older, ancient stuff and what have you. And so between the state of Nevada and the country of Greece, I think that's a good chunk of distance, probably like about 10,000 miles. And they come in fairly well.
Now, is this something, if millions of people had one of these, would it still function? Or would that cause any kind of interference? Or?
Well, you have to have licenses, to be able to transmit. But, the ham radio people are still using ionospheric communications. I think they're about the only ones left.
You had, was it 3 FCC licenses by the time you were like 16 or something like that?
Most of that stuff's obsolete now, but in the day, when that stuff was happening, I had 3. I had the television, radio broadcasting, and I had the radar endorsement, and I had the amateur. But at any rate, there's no laws or regulations or anything anymore. So basically, the FCC just got rid of all that. So now anybody can go into a radio station and operate it. and consequently it's starting to sound like that. But you still, the transmit, you still have to have a station license. So all FM and AM radio stations are still required to have a station license. And if you're going to do it on your own, you have to petition the FCC for a station license. And that's usually done through the amateur radio fraternity. But then it kind of turns into, an evening in the Greyhound bus station, and you can't really do much of anything functional because everybody's interfering with each other and what have you. And then you've got this problem now, call it the China harp. China has this massive jamming transmitter, and they're just playing hell with some of the bands.
What are they doing with it?
They're blasting the Earth with electromagnetic waves for a purpose we don't know. And also, there's a Trojan horse built into every electronic device that you buy that's made in China. And what it does is it jams out radio for a few hundred feet in every direction, and then the utility companies are rewiring the entire power grid at great expense to carry this interference everywhere, because the objective of the, whatever you want to call them, the deep state or whatever, is to eliminate radio and get you on the internet.
Oh. Now I know that our brain, it processes information electrically through neurotransmitters and electrical impulses. We're basically antennas decoding electrical signals. And I believe music used to be tuned to a certain frequency for the standard tuning, and now it's been changed with the Catholic Church. What can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it started off as, it depends how you want to approach it, but it used to be using the frequency of A. The Pythagorean frequency is 426 2/3, I believe, and you just derive from C being 256. And it got changed in the medieval days to 432 for reasons I don't fully understand. And then around the time of World War II, it got changed to 440, which from the standpoint of the ancient and classical orientated musicians is an abomination. And in order for it to work numerologically, which what music was originally intended to be by Pythagoras and the people that preceded him, is 426 2/3 would have to be the A. So I did a presentation called the Musical Seismograph, which is the project that's pending now with the facilities that have been made available to me. And I went overboard in that presentation and got into the full theoretical depths of everything. And one chapter of that was the whole Pythagorean musical system based on harmonics and the 426 2/3 and et cetera. And in the process of doing that, it took several months to figure all that out. After I got that in my head, when I would listen to that music from back then, Bach and Handel and all that, the music took on a whole different character once my brain understood its inner working mechanism. It was quite exhilarating. So at any rate, that material is available, but the problem I'm having is I have thousands and thousands of pages of finished notes and all these massive presentations that need to be, edited down into smaller pieces and what have you, but no one's interested in funding it. So basically the bulk of my material will never be seen by anybody because no one's interested in funding having it edited and printed. So I've just given up on it.
You have so many interesting stories. You're kind of, I guess, referred to, I think in one video, as an analog hacker. You could basically make phones ring anywhere from your patch panel and listen in on funny phone calls. And
that's when I was at the one of the main nodes of the Defense Communications System when I was in the Navy.
Yeah, yep,
I could like build up patches all the way around the world.
And what does that mean to build up a patch?
Well, what I would do is, there's a system of stations, carrier telephone stations, like, the old TD2 microwave sites you used to see on the hilltops with the big giant horns, and the innocuous brick buildings in some corner of town that were packed with millions of vacuum tubes and what have you that processed the long-distance signals. So they're spaced like typically every 30, 50 miles. So what I would do is, from my station, or the central station, which I was working at, which made it easier because I had 5 or 6 links going out where at the repeater site there was only what went through the repeater site. But I would call the next station, and I had the master telephone book for the Defense Communications System at my disposal. The thing must have weighed over 100 pounds, and it was classified confidential. It's not something that you spread around or gave copies to, but it gave you a complete listing of every connection in a particular hemisphere that I was in, which was the Western Hemisphere, and I was in the Philippines. So you call one station and say you want to patch such and such group out of such and such super group, such and such channel. You want to patch it to such and such and such and such and such and such again. And then once you've got that link, you've at the next station, you have the guy there, make the patch, and you can build up patches 10,000 miles long and loop them all the way around back to your original patch board. And then you send out a signal and wait for it to come out the other end and see, how echoey or distorted it would be. The Navy did not discourage me from doing these things because it kept me active, very active within the defense communications system so that I would spot things that were screwed up. And they had capitalized on that later on to have me solve problems that people just could not figure out of what was wrong in the system. It was probably one of the best experiences in my life to be 19 years old and have a $2 billion communication complex sanctions as my personal toy.
Wow. Yeah, you're basically the central link of communications, right?
Yeah.
And you used to mess with the Air Force, I think.
Well, the Air Force was making problems for everybody, particularly the Navy, so I was able to put them in their place, which, of course, delighted the Navy, and I was a hero.
Just a random question. What is a geomagnetic oscillator?
You might be talking about the Tesla Geodynamic or mechanical oscillator, the Tesla's earthquake thing.
I think that is what it was. It was in a lecture where you were talking about.
Yeah, I don't really know a lot about that other than the theory and, and the stories of what Tesla had done. Basically, it's a mechanical analog of his electrical transmission. It's monopolar, so that the normal Newtonian action-reaction principle no longer applies, and it can push without having to push against anything. That's the fundamental principle of most of Tesla's transmission schemes. That's why they generally cannot be understood by academians or physicists.
And there was something else I was kind of having trouble understanding. You were talking about the hysteresis of the ether.
Yeah, that was, Steinmetz felt that there really was not electromagnetic waves, that it was the ether that was sucking the power up and not electromagnetic radiation, which is a unique way of looking at it. And he approached electrical engineering from that standpoint for making his calculations of power losses due to electromagnetic radiation and what have you. It's a rather broad view that would allow for some interesting research if one was equipped to do such research.
I wanted to kind of end it on an interesting question. What is the theory of cosmic superimposition?
That was Wilhelm Reich's theory that you have what are called orgone streams. Orgone was kind of his name for the ether, but it was an organic living ether. He did a lot of experiments to justify his belief that such a thing existed. And these streams basically emerge from, like the sun and galaxies and all this type of stuff. And then when two of them approach each other, they get pulled into each other and then coalesce into a spiral, which then causes the process of basically creation. And then matter and energy and what have you will basically distill out of the superimposition of these two streams. He wrote a whole book called Cosmic Superimposition. And when I had first obtained the appearance of a galaxy in a street lamp using the Tesla transformers as the stream generators, so to speak, that was when I was also studying the works of Wilhelm Reich and reading the Cosmic Superimposition book. And that's when I came up with the term the cosmic induction generator to describe the transformer that did this.
What are some good resources for people who are interested in Pythagoras? Do you have any books that you would recommend?
Well, it's hard to say. I got most of it out of the music stuff. It's mostly esoteric works that are, have to be taken with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
But what got me started in this was a book called The Music of the Spheres. It caused a flashback on my earlier studies when I studied music in college, the ancient music. And that's a good starting point. You have to watch out because the scientism academia crowd did not like that book, so they came up with one with the same title to counteract it. So you want the one that's written by, the author is Jamie Jameson.
Jamie Jameson.
And that book was the basis for my presentation. The Power of the Ether as related to music and electricity was based on that book. So a lot of times my presentations are based on a particular book. Like the presentation that I gave, The History and Theory of Electricity, or Explosion at the Shipyard, that's based on a book by a mathematician called E.T. Whittaker, and called History and Theory, Theories and History of the Ether and Electricity. So there's a number of different editions of the book. The earliest one is the best, but it's also the hardest to find. And the Whittaker is Wittkaker. He was probably one of the most prominent mathematicians of that era, and at the point in which the relativists and what have you were playing havoc with the ether theories. He wrote that book to make sure, that all of that was quantified and that the ether concept would not get buried. And that was the basis for that presentation that I mentioned.
And then I know you're a fan of the book. I forget the name of the author. I think he has a couple books. One was The Evolution of Matter, and then the other was The Evolution of Forces.
I wrote a paper out of my, how would you say, what I learned out of those books and lots of others that I read at the same time. I think it's available on my website. It's called The Revival of the Science of Electricity in the Digital Age. And that basically, a good 40% of what's in there was derived from Dr. Laban, and then a lot of the contemporaries, J.J. Thompson and Larmor, Heaviside. That was kind of, that late 1890s into the early 1900s was when a lot of this stuff was written. So I kind of compiled it all into a kind of a, where do we begin to revive the science of electricity, which the Einsteiners and the physicists have completely destroyed.
It's fascinating. Is there anything that you want to add before we wrap this up?
Well, I think we kind of covered pretty much most of it. Well, I mean, there's there's all kinds of little bits and pieces, but you have to remember that, it's been so long and things have deteriorated so far that, I'm not quite as, hopping on these things as I would, let's say, 20 years ago. But I know a lot more than I did 20 years ago. And consequently, I'm still writing, but there's no means to get this material out. I don't see where anyone's going to fund it.
Well, for those listening, EDP Laboratories, Inc. is a 501 nonprofit. They appreciate any donations to support Eric's work, so you guys can go and check that out. And Eric, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. It was a fascinating conversation. So just thank you again.
Okay, well, you're welcome. Anytime.
All right. Have a good one, Eric.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.